Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video I wanted to go into the thought process of how a build comes together, and that's going to be on a glass red, as that's going to hit all of the parts of what a red build especially will, the thought processes of putting together a red build. And it's going to be split into two videos. In this first video, I'm going to keep it a lot more general, and I'm also not going to use calculation sheets at all. I will use a calculator, so we're just going to do basic addition and multiplication and stuff like that, but nothing quite in-depth. And in the second part, we'll go quite in-depth, and I'll make multiple calculation sheets, and we'll dial the build in that. In this one, we're just going to go through basically the way that most people will start putting builds together. Some of the choices are going to be quite obvious, but I want to go through everything, and we're going to go slot by slot through the entire build. And that's because quite often something small is not known to a player, and that will impact the choices that they make. And that's usually where wrong decisions in builds, or builds that are not set up optimally, usually comes from, is just not knowing something specific. So yeah, let us hop into my inventory. So I have prepared this character with a gray build, and that's just so that we can basically go slot by slot and talk about some of the choices and just go through the entire build and just put it together. One thing that I will use as well for today is, firstly, of course, just a calculator, just in simple mode. And I'm also going to use the Discord spreadsheet, as it's commonly known, one of the two major community spreadsheets. And that's just so that I have all of the bonuses and such. As we're going to go into, there are several tabs at the bottom. I'll link to this spreadsheet, of course, as well. And it is quite an in-depth resource, so it's quite useful to have access to it. And there are builds in there. All of the stats are in there. But for today, especially, I want to have this, which is all of the brand sets and all of their bonuses quite easily viewable, so that we can so I don't have to go through them in game. Now, when we want to make a glass red, we're going for all out damage, and that is the first point of how build comes together. Is what is our intent? What are we going for? And sometimes what you intend for going for will maybe not work, will maybe be too easy to die with, might not actually work out because mechanically it just doesn't work out well. But you first start with the intent. Now, with the glass red, as it is one of the oldest builds, starting out with Warlords of New York, when the Gear 2.0 came in and we had the big changes in gear. At the very start of it, a glass red became very popular, especially with a rifle back then, but that was due to balancing towards rifles at that point. It was quite obvious how it should be put together, as the parts that we had there were basically 6 parts that we had access to that would work in there. Now, to go through it here is usually where most choices start. And that is knowing what all of the brand bonuses are, because the layout is going to be defined by the brands, and then we have access to stats underneath it. One way to think of builds as well is, if I actually take this back in the game, is that every piece is basically 4 stats. So we have, if I look at this Fenris mask, we have 4 or 5 stats, I should say, because 3 of the pieces, of course, have mod slots on them. But it is a brand bonus, then it is a core, and then it is 2 minor attributes, and then on some of the parts, of course, a mod slot as well. So it is basically just those, it's an amalgamation of just a bunch of stats. And it becomes the choice of which stats do you want. Now, with the brands, of course, they're locked in to being brand bonuses, and that's why we're going to start just on this part of the spreadsheet there, and I can make it a little bit bigger as we're going to focus especially. So on a glass red, we're going to avoid most pieces that do not have damage bonuses. Now, on the blue end, almost none of the pieces on the first part have any useful. We're going for AR as well, of course, because that's the general weapon that most people will go after. And we have no bonuses on the first slot on blue cord items, as none of them will apply to an AR. So even if we were to go, for instance, for, let's say, this 5 weapon damage, not that you should, you would at least have to, quote-unquote, waste a brand bonus. A brand bonus that is not applying to the damage. And with this one, with this build, it is our intent to maximize damage. So, yeah, no blue items going to go in there. Same on the yellow pieces. None of them have anything on the first brand that would help. And none of the second or third ones are useful to us in any real capacity. So we end up with just all of the red pieces. And looking at the brand, what we end up is that it becomes quite quickly obvious that if we are especially going for a crit chance crit damage build, which is the generous way, as we could of course go headshot, but that is not the common choice, because then you would have to also go for heads, and that is not always viable. So we end up with a few brands. Immediately is that, so if we go through it just one by one, Araldi doesn't really do anything for us. Seska really does, but just on the first piece. Douglas and Harris doesn't really. Fenris does on the first piece. There's the second piece bonus that could be useful, and then especially so things like stability and accuracy we're going to avoid, as if the game was a lot more recoil heavy or something, it could make sense. But you can control a weapon quite well with mine without any weapon handling at all, just having the minor bonuses from your watch already at the level 40. That's usually enough for most people. So we're going to avoid any stability, accuracy, and stuff like that. Then we have Grupo, 15 crit damage is very good. And then all of the other ones, the second one isn't. So we're not going to ever go for that third either. Now, Petrov doesn't really do anything for us, as we're going for AR. But there's, of course, contractors. Providence is then another piece, but it starts with 15% headshot damage, and headshot damage isn't preferred, but it's going to especially be relevant to here, because the named piece with perfect glass cannon is a Providence brand, of course, the sacrifice. So that makes Providence a choice, as especially in the second piece and the third piece of Providence, where we do have good brand bonuses. Now, Overlord, again, doesn't have good brand bonuses, but again, we are going to use the Overlord piece, of course, because that's going to be Fox's Prayer, once we get there, it will become obvious why. Now, Sokolov could be used as especially for the second piece, but we would be wasting a brand slot on this standard SMG. We're maining an AR. Walker and Harris is an interesting piece, as of course we do have 5% weapon damage on the first part, and then 5% damage to armor. Now, usually with Walker and Harris, it becomes this weapon damage is the exact same as having the weapon damage that a specific weapon damage from Fenris, for instance. So this 10% AR damage and this 5% weapon damage, in effect, are acting the exact same. And of course, the Fenris is 10%, where the Walker and Harris is 5% on the first piece. But it is an interesting option, and especially in the second video, I'll go into why we don't use it actually. But it seems in general a viable option. Just looking at just this list, you might think 5% damage to armor especially might be useful. Now, having gone through this list, let us hop back into the game and I'm going to start on basically what we're going to fill the slots with. As yeah, I have all of these as gray slots, so it's obvious when we add something in. Now to start off, we're going to make a glass red. We've chosen glass. We know that glass is a powerful talent, and it is then obvious that we either go for the perfect glass chest or we go for a normal chest with glass cannon. Now, the end result is going to be that perfect glass cannon is going to win out. But to get to that conclusion, we would need to do actual spreadsheet calculations. So that's going to be in the second video. But first, for this first one, we're just going to pick a perfect glass cannon just because it is 5% more. And it is this all damages you deal is amplified, can be easily construed to not be additive to something else. So you can guess from this that this is multiplicative to everything else and is additive to nothing. So that 30%, even if you don't do the spreadsheet calculations, you can somewhat surmise that 5% more from that is a multiplicative to everything else is going to likely beat out most of the other choices that we have. But of course, first we have to make those choices before it becomes obvious in the end. So going for perfect glass cannon means that we're also then going for the Providence. And then it also makes sense because we are putting it in a bonus that isn't the greatest in general for a crit chance, crit damage build, 15 headshot damage, as headshot is also additive to the crit damage. So those two stats get added together and then multiply against the rest. So in general, you want to avoid mixing them together. You want to avoid having a half headshot damage, half crit damage build, unless you're doing something very specific in the case of one specific exotic. But in general builds, you want to go for one or the other. And in this case, we're mostly going for critical hit damage. But in this case, we are taking that first piece of Providence, but mostly for its talent. So putting that in basically informs us that we can really easily go for this other 10% crit chance and this 15% crit damage. It makes sense now to go for those, as especially if we then want to go back actually for a second to the spreadsheet, is we have to fill 6 slots. And once we've chosen actually this Providence, it kind of all falls into place. We have the Providence. Crit chance we know is a good stat. Crit damage we know is a good stat. So we can go 3 pieces of Providence. Then we can have 1 piece of Grupo, 1 piece of Seska, and 1 piece of Fenris. Now, we've chosen those 6 pieces, and we've chosen them only for their brand bonuses. Now, later on, we're going to run into 1 piece, of course, the Fox's Prayer, that's going to compete and actually win against having a good brand bonus just because of its secondary stats. And once we get there, we'll discuss it. So, jumping back to the game, we have taken the sacrifice. That is our chess piece. Then, of course, also stacked with crit chance and crit damage. Now, this mod slot is already filled with the crit damage, but starting out, that's not perfectly clear. But what we would know already is that crit chance caps at 60. So we're going to try to at least reach that. And we are going to reach that. I can spoiler warning. But how we get there is, dependent on how many rolls, of course, of crit chance we have on gear. Now, having taken the chest, as the chest and the backpack, of course, have talents. So usually those come first, as they inform the rest of the decisions once you start making them. And you basically have to just start somewhere. Now, going to the backpack, having taken Providence chest, there's actually a Providence named backpack, which is, of course, the gift, with perfect vigilance. So then it becomes also a choice if you have that, to put that in. But we could have any of the other, if we don't have a gift, we can put in vigilance, as especially we want to go for vigilance as. Now, going for glass, of course, we know, having skipped looking at all of the talents, which you could do, you could just go through all of the talents, read them, but just to avoid going through all of the talents and and talking about all of them, here vigilance makes the most sense, as that is the biggest bonus that is active also from the first shot. You of course can lose it, that's its downside, but especially this piece is informed by playing with it. So what you can do is play with different talents and see how they play. And if you want to go in depth into them, you can record yourself playing with them, see what the uptime is. And in the end, it will always be a discussion on which one is better. Because just from the way that they differently work, all of the talents, a case can be made for several other choices. So companion comes to mind, wicked in some ways comes to mind, and concussion, of course. But in this case, we're going for vigilance, because also we can go for the named variant here, of course. But what we really want starting out is actually to go, the decision that we made just regarding brand bonuses is to have 3 pieces of Providence, a piece of Grupo, a piece of Seska, and a piece of Fenris. And that's, again, just thinking about brand bonuses. So we're not really looking at stats yet. And that's why we're leaving out Fox's Prayer at that point. So we have 2 pieces of Providence. Now we're going to go for a 3rd piece of Providence, because the 3rd bonus of Providence is also good. In this case, I will actually take it here on the holster. And so we have now 3 pieces of Providence in there. So we want to have a piece of Seska, a piece of Grupo, and a piece of Fenris. In the mask slot, I'll put a Fenris. I believe I have a Grupo at the ready here. I actually have the wrong Grupo grabbed. But I'll put a blue core one in for just now. And then, so I do not, I believe, own any, actually I can quickly, I thought I was, had all of the preparation done, but I actually didn't. So, and I'm going to swap it around. I'm going to go a Seska glove and a Grupo kneepad. Now, anybody that actually knows a glass rat goes, this is wrong. And there is an obvious error in the kneepad slot. But if we're only going off of brand bonuses, this is what makes sense. Now, and this was usually also what we actually, in the first few weeks after Warlords came out, this became the first easier builds, as we had access to all of these items from that point. Seska and Grupo were part of Season 1, so you could get them starting out with Warlords in the very first release back then. So we had access to all of these parts. Walker and Harris, for instance, came later, so that's also why it wouldn't have featured all the way back then. And this layout is then just brand bonuses that work. So we have the 3 from Providence, all of them going towards damage. One of them, that first one, that headshot damage, not being perfectly in line for us, but it's still, we're making that choice to go both the named piece and of course also having the 3 bonuses. Now, the assault rifle damage from Fenris makes sense. The Seska makes sense. And also the Grupo makes sense. Now, if we then look at our stats, just with those items, we see that we're already at 60 crit chance and we don't even have any mods on our weapon yet. Now, if I actually just briefly take away the Seska piece, and that's just to avoid calculating anything at this point, we see that we're now at 50. And this is, of course, with the watch all maxed out. On this character, I have all of the watch points maxed out. So if we then decide to go for a weapon, we can, that will start influencing our choices about crit chance all of a sudden. because what you usually want to do is, if you have a high-end weapon, is if I actually take this weapon and actually strip it, all of its slots, we can see that with this FAMAS, I'm at 50 crit chance, 100... well, the crit damage isn't all maxed out because not all of the mods that I have on this is currently maxed out. But that Seska piece is taking us to 60 already without any mods on the weapon, but we could just have those mods be on the weapon. So that indicates to us that that Seska piece is maybe not the best choice. Because we can here already take 2 crit chances, 5%, and we would again be at 60. And of course, crit chance is rare like that, as it's has a cap. That is what informs us of the choices that we make towards crit chance. Now, of course, we now have 5 pieces as well here that have all crit chance, crit damage. So all of the pieces I'm going for are going to be the same layout, having crit chance, crit damage on the minors, because that's, of course, what we're going for. We're trying to maximize out our crit damage. So no other role there makes sense. Then the mods are all crit damage because we are reaching the crit cap. So that at that point, once we understand that we're reaching the crit cap already, and we actually even have 1 mod slot on the weapon free, then we can decide that, okay, all of the mods can be crit damage, of course. Now we still have this Grupo on the kneepad slot, and then we have thrown away our idea of using a Seska. Now, if we go back to the spreadsheet and try to look at what could we put in that slot, then this on brand bonuses alone, again, this Walker and Harris looks like it makes sense. It's 5% weapon damage. It is at least a bonus that is still applying, because if we would have a piece of Seska where we're just going over the cap, we could, of course, put 10 crit damage on the weapon in mods instead of the 10 crit chance, because they're the same. But it should be obvious that if you have the choice between 5 crit chance and 5 crit damage, especially just looking at the brand bonuses or the rolls on gear, you can see that usually the roll on gear is twice the if I take us back in the game, is twice the amount for crit damage. So from that, you can already kind of surmise, even without calculating anything out, that yeah, usually crit chance is going to be half the amount on gear that it is on of crit damage. So if you have the ability on weapons to choose between, so in this slot we could go this 5 crit chance. On the crit damage end, it is the same 5%. So we could be either 5 crit chance or 5 crit damage. And on gear, it's 6% and 12%. And that should inform you that, yeah, crit chance is quite invaluable to put on the mod slots of the weapon. And that's why we choose to put those on the weapon, to have most of the mod slots on the weapon function as giving us crit chance. And I'm not going to go into the specific weapon choice, as that is quite an in-depth thing, but I will say that most of the ARs, especially in the game, are quite balanced in a range of each other, where especially the ones that somewhat have less DPS output in either burst or sustain usually have something that they make up for with their accuracy or their damage per mag. So it all evens out a little bit, but the FAMAS, if you're going for a weapon, the FAMAS is usually, it is an outlier actually. It is very much a little bit too good. So in this case, I'm going with a FAMAS, but that is, of course, knowledge that you just can go through and find something that works for you. So for instance, I quite often like the Mark 16, where I know that is a choice that not many will agree with, but I prefer it for its accuracy and its damage per mag. And the FAMAS is very much obvious that it is, especially going for damage, it is an obvious choice because it's the highest burst weapon. Now, just to fill out the mods on this weapon already, what we're also going to do is take the plus 20 round mag, as just having more rounds to fire is going to be the obvious choice, as we could have a little bit more crit damage, we could have a little bit more stability, or just a smaller 10 rounds. Of course, this comes with a 10% reload speed debuff, but this weapon is also fast down, so it's not going to matter. Also, this 10% is not a significant amount in comparison to the 20% rounds, 20 rounds that you get. Now, to get the final answer on of that, you need to actually use a calculation sheet to see the difference between them, and it becomes obvious that they're. So in this video, though, we're not going into calculation sheets. We're not going to go in depth into that. But you can usually, what you also always can do is just try it out in the game. Once you get a feel for builds, it becomes obvious that, okay, this build is now a little bit stronger. When I put this in, it feels a little bit stronger. Or if you lose something, if you, for instance, go crit damage mod here on the mag slot and run with it for a while, you will usually quickly find that, okay, this feels weaker once you're a little bit more attuned to the build. Now, of course, getting to that point just takes time, and that's also the case for just figuring everything out. It usually just takes a time investment of going through everything, reading everything, and then having a little bit of an understanding of what everything does. Now, we are at 60 crit chance. We have the availability of 1 mod slot still on the weapon. That can be crit chance as well still, so that's going to inform some of our decisions here as well. So what I'm actually going to do is just quickly check if I have a Grupo glove as well with that is full red. I do, and inventory is filled up. I'm going to just briefly, yeah, that's why this is a rambling. I'm not as well prepared as my guides. And I'm going to grab that Grupo glove. So we're going to move the Grupo into this glove slot. And we're going to leave this kneepad slot now for now, just empty. It's a gray piece, not giving us any stats yet. But we have informed ourselves into what the layout is looking like already while reaching 60% crit chance. Now, the thing that then becomes the choice is we can have a piece here or in any of the other slots that doesn't need to have a crit chance roll because we're already there. And of course, the two obvious, well, 3 actually should be obvious in choices, actually even a 4th, and that is contractors, where you can have a crit damage roll next to another damage stat. So in the case of contractors, damage to armor, and still have a red core, and you're then wasting this brand bonus. But of course, the only real other choice that we had looking at the brand list was Walker and Harris with 5% weapon damage. So what you then have to consider is this 8% of damage to armor worth more than having 5% weapon damage? Because of course on that one we could maybe have a weapon handling roll or something like that, but we couldn't have a damaging stat down here, and that's what influences the choice there. So in this case then the other pieces would be a Fox's Prayer, the Picaros, and also actually, of course, the Hollow Man Mask, if you can get it in all red with crit damage next to the health damage roll. And that's the case with all of them. You want to have crit damage because we're capping out on crit chance. And that's the thing with high-end build always, is they will cap out on crit chance quite easily because you have 10 from the watch. You can have usually 10 quite easy from a bonus. So either from the 2-piece Providence or the Seska piece. And then with, so that's already 20. With 5 rolls on the gear, so every piece has crit chance as a roll, and the mods are all crit damage. That means that's another 30, and then you only need 10. So the weapon can provide at least 10 quite easily, of course. So then it becomes the choices of, okay, what named items do we have? And here, just to avoid going through all of the named items, I've listed the 4 that have a stat here, that have an attribute that could be a damaging attribute, and then we're basically choosing to waste the brand bonus to go for a damaging stat down here. Now, of course, you have to beat a brand bonus of Walker and Harris. That's the question. And what we can definitely say is that 5 weapon damage is quite easily going to lose to 8% damage to targets out of cover. And for that, you need to have the knowledge of how weapon damage is additive to it all of itself. So that if I actually, at this point, then we'll go into one simple calculation. And that is, so we want to see, adding in 5% weapon damage to this build, how much does it actually add? So the actual increase, because it's not 5%, it's additive to stats that already exist on this build. So what that means is that if we look at our weapon damage, which is this, actually, let me quite quickly swap this grade 20 FAMAS. Actually, I do not have a non-graded FAMAS on this account. I just realized, of course, which is a bad choice for me, but we'll make do. Just because that would have made this easier and rounder number to work with. So what we have here is we already have 108 all weapon damage, and then we have an active 40% assault rifle damage bonus. So that's a 148% already. And if I actually give myself access to the calculator, if we take 148%, what that is in actuality is a 2.48 multiplier. And how we get there is that we have a 148%. So in calculation wise, that will, instead of being 148, that's 1.48 or 1.48. And what that is adding to is it's multiplying towards another already existing number, and that is a base amount. And that's why also in the weapon calculation, it's all 1 plus the bonus, 1 plus the bonus. Because otherwise, of course, if your bonus is underneath 100%, then you would be losing calculation-wise if you were to have, let's say, 30% weapon damage or 50% weapon damage to make it easier on myself. And you take a build and you just multiply it by just 0.5. You're, of course, halving the damage. Whereas it's adding 50% to the build, so it's 150%. And in this case, it's 2.48. Or if I actually clear this out first, 2.48. So 148% of weapon damage is 2.48 multiplier altogether. And the difference between two of them, or well, actually what I should say is, this is of course the one that we have now. We are trying to figure out how much adding 5 to this with the brand bonus of Walker and Harris increases this by. So what we need to actually do is to get the increase is think about what our stats would become once we put the Walker and Harris in there. And of course, with 248, we're adding 5 to the end of it. So it's going to be 253 total, well, 153 combined weapon damage. And that's going to be a 2.53 multiplier. Now we're going to divide this 2.53 by the amount that we already have, which is 2.48. So this is the increase between going 5% or adding 5% weapon damage versus what we had before. So we see the actual increase of just that 5% weapon damage. And if we multiply those together, we can see it's 1.02 and then a lot of numbers behind that. But what we can tell from here is that that is actually, so that's 5% weapon damage on this build, which also admittedly has FAMAS already as well, kind of messing up the numbers part of it for a little bit. because it's adding to weapon damage, so it's diminishing the return per point for weapon damage already. We have that's going to be a 2%. So how to read this is that this is 102% of the other number, and that means that we're gaining 2%. So putting in 5 weapon damage in here, we're gaining 2%. And then it becomes obvious that if we go back, and this was also, for instance, for myself, in the very beginning, damage to armor was easy to understand, of course, but damage to targets out of cover initially was not well understood. We didn't really know what it was. I'm talking about when Warlords of New York initially came out, of course. Now, back then, a lot of people would run contractors and then not the piece against it. But what we know nowadays is that damage to targets out of cover, or well, we figured out quite quickly as well back then, is that this damage to targets out of cover is actually quite active. So this is every enemy that is not in cover. So they have specific animations where they are in cover in the same way that players are. So when you're attached to cover. But what happens is that NPCs, when you start shooting them, even on heroic, you stagger them out of cover quite quickly. So players don't have that effect just from being shot, but if you get hit by grenade or something or explosion, you usually get staggered out of the cover, and that's the same that is happening to them. But they're just having that happens to them just from being shot. And quite often as well, a lot of enemies don't reach cover because it will kill them too quickly. Some enemies can take cover, like warhounds or heavies and such. And knowing all that together makes it that this stat becomes quite obvious as being quite strong. So we are giving up the brand bonus, but we're gaining the best option that we basically have for this build. Now, this is obviously very much the best option, and then we're going to take that. And then the other piece, of course, that I was talking about was contractors, and contractors is damage to armor, and that one becomes a lot more about how you basically justify it. Are you fighting enough damage to armor or armor enemies for that to be worthwhile? And the answer depends quite a lot on if you're playing in groups or solo, what content you're doing. So for instance, in raids, in Countdown, there is a lot more armor than there is in missions or solo. And that ends up that this number is basically active about 50% of the time. And that is quite a lot less than damage to targets out of cover, which as a guesstimate is around 85 to 90% active. And for those both, you would need to play a lot and just look at content and calculate it out a little bit. So you would need knowledge that isn't initially available. And that is usually the issue with understanding some of these things. And some of the ones are very much how people justify putting them in. So for instance, in the case of if I have a Picaros, which I do, a Picaros, of course, also kind of looks like it makes sense. You have that weapon damage bonus there, but you, along as that stat, but what you can't have on the Picaros, which we're going here for all-out damage as much as we can't have a red core alongside of it. So we would have to go for a blue core, and that makes it so that Picaros makes sense whenever you actually were going to go a blue core anyway. Then it makes sense. And for instance, in PvP, that's why Picaros is that popular. Same for the stat of the Hollow Man, which is the other, of course, other option, which is that 10% health damage. But health damage is even going to be disputably less active than armor damage, usually. And it is quite a hard piece to get. But it is one of the choices that can be made. But you would, of course, need to find a piece that has crit damage and health damage on it, as this one does come with an armor core as well. So you would need to find a piece to record. And that's usually why Hollow Man doesn't show up in most builds, because you have contractors, and contractors is arguably more active justifiably more active and than it. So, and it's also much easier to get. So yeah, we have put in 6 pieces, discussed why we've chosen them. Now, one of the things that we can do is we still have a mod slot on the weapon. The obvious choice is, and this is usually what people go for, is to either give up one of the, because we could gain another 5 crit chance, so we can give up actually this a crit chance attribute and go for one of those special that have an attribute, so not the Bramos, but the attribute that does damage alongside of crit damage. And that is usually the choice that people go for, is to put in contractors, even though it's quite very dependent. To cut to the end, to give the spoiler warning, that one is quite dependent on what stats you go for. Of course, we could also stay with that group of piece and put a 5 crit damage mod on here, or put something like a stability mod on it. But there's also one other option that we have, and that is to instead go for a little bit of a weapon handling. So I'm going to actually swap to this Providence glove here, which has a weapon handling roll. So we're giving up that crit chance, but we're gaining weapon handling. And this is actually the choice that I go for. Now, of course, now we have 4 pieces of Providence, which is one too many. So this piece then becomes actually, I have to move that around. And do I have a Grupo mask real quick, or a Grupo holster? Because I actually now realize that this character usually is filled up with a Grupo backpack. Well, I do have a gift actually on this account. I actually use a Grupo backpack, and that's just because I don't care enough to redo all of those builds. So we're moving stuff around, and this is usually the case. So you can move all of the brands around as long as they're not locked to a named slot, so that Fox's Prayer can't go anywhere else. But those other 5 slots, the orientation of them doesn't really matter, except for what we swap out. So, for instance, if we were to put a Coyote in, then it becomes a little bit important what is in that mask slot. Now, I've taken then this weapon handling roll here, and that's put us at 54 crit chance. So now we can take that this other mod here, and what we're basically doing there is one of the choices that you can make. So we could either go contractors here and be with 3 crit chance on the weapon, and then gain 8 weapon handling, which is 8% both accuracy and stability, and also to reload speed and swap speed, even though swap speed doesn't really work. But especially having it also affect our reload speed can make a difference but it only makes a difference to our sustain. But sometimes this will do more damage when there aren't that many armored enemies, and then the contractors will do more damage when there are many armored enemies. And that's the choice between the two. And of course, here then we're going for a little bit more weapon handling roll. Because yeah, we could have this be a crit chance and then put a crit damage roll on the weapon, a crit damage mod on the weapon. But I much prefer to have that crit chance be on the weapon, because we're effectively using a lot more there, because what we could have there is, for instance, the 20% stability mod, which some people choose to put there. I would much rather have a 5% crit chance there, and then gain this 8% weapon handling, which is both affecting both stability and accuracy and the reload speed. So that's the choice that I usually go for. But with those, it becomes very much, you basically need calculation sheets. You can't really easily use a calculator to get to those results. And that's why calculation sheets do matter. Now, we have filled basically our 6 slots and our main weapon slot. Now, we have a few slots left, so let's go through those. What becomes obvious once we have this layout, so we're going Fox's Prayer variant, we're not going for the contractors. Rifles, we have a bonus towards rifles. So it makes sense to have a rifle in there because especially the second weapon is mostly there to either apply some utility. For instance, you can put also a Scorpio there. But what I quite often more do is to have a secondary in there that is doing something useful for me. So a Scorpio very much is that as well. But a rifle is bonused here as well and can give me a second ammo source, so that if I run out of ammo on my primary, I can swap to a secondary. So in this case, I'm picking a classic M1A, and I'm picking, in this case, boomerang, but many talents can apply. And again, for weapon choices, it would be too in-depth to go into it here, because you can basically, starting out, follow advice of others of what weapons are best in classes, in weapon types, and looking at burst and sustain tables can help a little bit, but you actually need to have the understanding of having ran most of the weapons, because the hard stats, which sustain, burst, mag, and stuff, those are all hard stats, or what I consider to be hard stats. But especially things like how effective it is at being kept on target, its recoil pattern, its accuracy, its stability, all of those kinds of things are soft stats, a little bit more nebulous to define precisely. And those matter as well. A lot of people forget about that kind of things quite quickly and go just by burst tables quite often. And I wouldn't recommend that. I would recommend, before going by burst tables, to go by advice of others first. And yeah, try them out. And sometimes some weapons mesh better with people. So yeah, we're going an AR and a rifle. Now, if I had contractors, an LMG could make sense as well, and LMGs have some uses as well to be used in these kinds of builds as an opener quite often, which is what I use them for quite often. But yeah, we have a rifle bonus, we can put that. Now, of course, the other obvious choice is to have a Scorpio there, and that's just to, once you've used the Scorpio a little bit, you'll understand that, yeah, it is a very good CCing tool and can save your life. It's giving up damage, and seeing as our intent here is to go for max out damage, and then the secondary is just there to basically give us a second ammo source, because the FAMAS does eat ammo, we're going to go with the M1A. And then pistol-wise, it doesn't really matter. It is really an utility thing. And one of the ones that quite often comes up for red builds, as they quite often do use a revive hive, of course, is to have this TDI card custom. And of course, the busy little bee can be used as well. So actually for this one, since our intent is damage and not to be able to use our reviver hive to heal our allies quite easily, actually I will grab a busy little bee. But of course, once you have an exotic, you can only have one exotic in your weapon slot or in your gear slots. Well, one in your gear slots, one in your weapon slots, and that means that we would lock ourselves out of having a Memento or Scorpio. So yeah, that's usually why you sometimes wouldn't go busy little bee. You can basically swap the exotic to a Scorpio and then have a TDI card custom. Now, skills wise, most of the player race will know that the hive is usually what all red builds do run, and yeah, that's for that self-revive mechanic of it. So that one is basically quite easy a choice to make. There is usually not many choices over having a self-revive, just because it's if you do go down, and a glass red, of course, with its incoming damage increase, is more likely to go down than most other builds. It is nice to have that skill pick you up and not inconvenience group members, or if you're solo, to actually not die in a single death. You get a second chance. And so we are going to take a reviver hive, and that's, yeah, that one is very much set, and that's very much a meta choice, and I don't mean meta in the way of what it commonly gets used as the best in slot kind of thing. What I mean is by meta-analysis. So the choice is available, analyzing them all, and then having basically a second choice of, okay, what is the choice to make, and considering all factors. So in this case, also for groups and stuff, it's also to not inconvenience your allies, to not be a dick towards them. So if you go down, you get yourself picked up. They don't have to waste your time on you, and you can pick up others. And that makes it that choice. Quite often, it depends on utility quite often as well. Now for the other one, we already do know most of the skills, of course, and the choices we can make there. The only one that really doesn't make sense for this build, where it quite often can make for red builds, is a shield, even though you can use it to corner peek, but it's less, glass applies to your shield as well. So it's less of a choice, especially nowadays with the disorient as well. That's just too annoying. So yeah, you usually go for something to CC with, and in the same way as why you would choose a Scorpio secondary is to just CC with it a little bit. So yeah, foam makes sense, blinded firefly makes sense. Stuff like awareness helpers as pulse is, normal pulses can be quite useful, but banshee pulse as well by going gunner can be quite useful. So for here, the thing that I'm usually would pick is actually a pulse, just a normal pulse. That is my tool that I quite often use. But I would recommend just basically picking your tool as to what you need. So sometimes a blinder is more useful, sometimes a chem launcher is useful, sometimes shock trap is useful, sometimes decoy is useful. All of those things can be useful. So it is quite situational. And that makes it that it's up to the player making the choice to make the choice. So in this case, I'll just pick something that works quite well for this build, foam, and put that in. Now, we filled up all of these slots down here. We haven't discussed this slot up here. Now, for that, I'm just gonna run across and go to our friend Rhodes. And specializations for red builds are just whatever you want them to be. Some builds are very reliant on the specialization, on a specific specialization. So for instance, a drone build will benefit quite a lot from going technician. Something like sniper builds quite benefit from going the TAC 50 route, and something like a tech tank could not exist without a technician at all, for instance. And yeah, that informs our decision making for some of those builds. Oh, and of course, explosive builds would quite benefit both in hardwired and just high-end variants, benefit a lot from demolition. Is too much for it to be disregarded easily. And in the case for red builds, it's basically whatever you want to pick them, and that's usually what I say with red build in showcases, is just they're agnostic to whatever you choose here. In the same way as that second skill, you have a lot of choices that are viable. So in this case, I would say the only thing that isn't totally viable for especially glass red is firewall, as it is most reliant on being close range. And glass red distance is one of the factors that you use in play to have a little bit more awareness around you and keep everything towards your front, basically, and not be overwhelmed quite easily. So everything except firewall makes sense here to use, especially if, yeah, for instance, gunner gives a lot of good bonuses to rate of fire on kill, armor on kill, to go through the list a little bit, and having a stability bonus while standing still and stuff, and ammo every few seconds. Technician can be used to go flatline and then give up. So that mod slot where we are now using it to go a crit chance and then using a weapon handling, you could actually take away that issue just by going flatline and using the technician pulse to eat up that mod slot, and then that weapon handling can become crit chance again, and then you're back at 60 while having flatline, which is one of the strongest talents in the game, at 15%, disregarding, and it's a separate multiplier, so it's disregarding any other of the stats you could have on your build. Demolitionist works well as it gives a decent group buff, it has a good specialization weapon, and has some of the things, especially for that kind of help with glass in the case of disregarding one explosion every minute. That can be quite useful to survive with glass. Crossbow for its fire grenades and giving that group buff, although it doesn't perfectly synergize here really. It can still be quite strong and useful to run crossbow as well. And attack 50 will give you a little bit of increased stability. It's one of its main bonuses of a headshot does not apply to our AR, but will to our rifle, as it doesn't apply to anything except rifles and marksman rifles. But it does have a stability increase. It has that drone, of course, and here's the stability, increased stability that is applying to all weapons. And there's a good grenade in the flashbang. So yeah, the specialization wise, we could basically pick any of these 5 for a glass red. And in this case, we're going to pick Demolitionist, which is one of the older, the old right choice before Gunner became the new right choice. But actually, yeah, so again, I'm reconsidering that now because, yeah, our intent is to go for maximizing out damage, and then Gunner actually makes sense because Gunner will provide us with a rate of fire bonus on kill, and that in this case will actually, yeah, it is a damage bonus, even though it is only 5%. It's very small. It is quite small, but in this case we don't have any other thing so rate of fire is actually a pool as well. So in the same way that weapon damage, for instance, was there, but we don't have any other sources of rate of fire on this build at all. So that 5% is still at its full 5%. We're also not getting rate of fire from the watch or anything. So it's completely undiminished on this build. Where, for instance, with the Striker, it is diminished the tiniest amount because Striker is providing 15 rate of fire as well. So this would then be the layout that we go for. And yeah, those are how we get to filling the slots. You basically go for an intent, think about a little bit, read up a little bit about what the choices that are available to you. So that's why we went through the brand lists and stuff. And also through the named list. And of course, all of these things usually require some knowledge, a little bit of having played the game for a while, and looking at some of the spreadsheets and such, and going through it and trying to inform yourself about what the options are. And that's usually the case with the decision making. It's not so much about just cramming everything in, it's making the best decision for a slot. So for instance, to give one of the common ones that people do wrongly, is to put in, which I don't believe I have on this account, is to put in an no, not the Night Watcher, but the chill out. Once I'm blanking on the name. The group, the Gila mask, the seasonal one, and that one is just giving up a brand bonus. So usually, whatever you do with it, you're also giving up a brand bonus, and usually what you're gaining for it is crit damage, and that just does not compete with other choices. And that's usually what makes something best in slot. It's not so much that it's, for instance, one of the common things that people often say about Fox's Prayer is, oh, it's multiplicative. That's the reason why it's good. It firstly isn't. Multiplicative usually implies that it's multiplicative to itself, which it isn't. We have 10 on the weapon as well as a third stat. And that's usually, all weapons should have damage to targets out of cover on the third stat. And the reason for it isn't that it's multiplicative. The reason for it is that it's the best choice once you calculate it out. Of course, in this case, we haven't calculated that, but we gave some reasoning as to why we would pick it. And yeah, in the second video, we'll go into the calculations. We'll make calculation sheets and go through them, and then it becomes obvious how much better an Fox's pair is than some of the other choices we can make here. And that, yeah, that is usually the choice making in here. One thing, of course, also that we've avoided here, and just want to discuss it briefly before I forget, is we haven't put a coyote in here. And that's because a coyote doesn't inherently show itself off without actually calculation sheet. So we will end up, of course, with a coyote in the end, but we won't yet here, because on just looking at it, it doesn't inherently make more sense than just having a fixed bonus, because and depending on play, you would think that maybe you don't really have a spot for that crit chance to go into in the mid-range, which most people will feel that they play in the mid-range, although some players quite much land in the long range. But most, let's call it more advanced players, will mostly land in that mid-range. And it's not inherently obvious that this is going to be a better bonus than what you could have there. And that's why we're skipping it for here, because to show that, we usually basically need to have calculation sheets. We can't do a simple calculation to get that answer. And that's also why quite often people don't land on that. And yeah, that is a little bit of the choice making of how to put glass red together, and why the choices are where they are. And in the second part, to move towards a conclusion to this video, in the second part, we'll go through some calculations, and we'll basically see what the difference is between going a provenance piece like this with this weapon handling versus on calculation end versus going contractors, what we could have, for instance, as well with going flatline, what the bonuses would be between just having, of the 4 named pieces that I mentioned here, having each singular one to calculate against each other. So we'll go a little bit more in depth and then reach our final conclusion. But just from simple reasoning and simple calculations, this is what we landed on, and this is what also was the case all those years ago when Warlords came out. Even before it, as we did get the gear before, or the list of what the changes would be before the patch hit, and from the first second it was obvious that a glass red was going to be a valuable build. Now, back then it landed quite often with rifles, but that was just a different balance, as back then rifles were just stronger than ARs were. Actually, rifles and LMGs were actually back then the choice that most people went with over ARs. And then ARs got buffed to be in line, and that's how we landed here. And yeah, so that video will likely be several videos after this one. It won't directly follow it up, as I want to prepare quite a lot of things for it. But actually, for my next video, I'll go into an in-depth guide to availability of exotics, as that is also something that's quite poorly understood, as what exotics are in what loot pools, how there's a difference between a general loot pool of exotics and the targeted loot pool of exotics, which is causing quite a few issues nowadays. And also I'm working on a graphic that goes into what exotics require, or just in general loot pool, which ones have a prerequisite of projects or getting them from seasons, and of course raid and DZ ones and legendary ones. And that's just to put it into a graphic and just have that be a tool just whenever people ask to just show them that. And also later on in the future, I'll make the same one for named items, as quite often people don't inherently know where which named item drops, especially things like the GIF that are DZ only. Then yeah, that can help those kinds of people. But yeah, the next one will be an in-depth guide into exotic availability. So yeah, I hope you join me for that one. And also, quite often nowadays, I'm streaming over on Twitch. I've did a few streams on YouTube as well, which I quite enjoyed, and I've now started doing it on Twitch as well. So I will link to my Twitch channel down below, and if you're interested, come hang out, come ask your questions if you have them, and I'm very much starting out, so I would love some follows and stuff over there. And yeah, so yeah, I hope you join me over there as well. Have a good night.